that red velvet rocking chair is where Lincoln was sitting on the night of April 14th.
It's not a matter of if Lincoln dies, it's when.
And they don't want Lincoln to die in the theater.
And that front door, that door opens up with Henry Safford calling out. They try and lay him on the bed. They realize the bed's a little too short.
Amazing stories in this house. This tailor who's making uniforms, even if he has Southern sympathies.
They are upstairs above our heads on the second floor. They have no clue what's happening beneath their very floorboard.
I find this so hard to believe, but he basically just passes out on the bed with Lincoln's blood and everything. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dana Schoaf, Director of Interpretation for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in beautiful downtown Frederick. And today, Chris Reed, Director of Membership and Events, who's behind the camera, and I are in the front parlor of the Peterson House in Washington, D.C. This is the house in which Abraham Lincoln died after he was mortally wounded by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, which is just right across the street. And I want to introduce our special guest today, Garrett Cost. How you doing?
Good, yourself, Dan.
Garrett, what's your title here at Ford's Theater?
Yes, so I'm one of the park rangers, one of the interpretive staff here at Ford's Theater.
And you went to Gettysburg College,
Yes,
right?
sir,
Studied under my friend Pete Carmichael, and you're one of the many students from Gettysburg that Pete Carmichael has put out in the Civil War world doing fantastic stuff. How long have you been here?
So I've been here with Ford's Theater only for about a year and a half or so.
Okay.
But I've been with the National Mall and the National Park Service for a little longer, about 2.5 years.
Fantastic. So the Peterson House, just to give you some background, belonged to William Peterson. And what was his wife's name?
Anna.
Anna.
William and Anna.
William and Anna. And they were immigrants from Europe that came over here. He built this house in the late 1840s, 1849.
1849.
And it's what is it, 3 or 4 stories is it considered?
So technically it's 3 stories of livable space. The downstairs portion is slightly recessed below the street level. So this is a standard federal style home here in Washington, D.C., where you enter into the half level. And that lower level would technically be for the help.
For the help.
For the help.
So this is on 10th Street, and if you've been down here, there's the Peterson House, the one next door to it, which you said is a little post-war, but most of it's very modern. You know, Ford's Theater, of course, is there. But at one time, the entire street kind of looked like the Peterson House. And just like today, housing is fairly difficult to find around D.C. It seems like it's always been that way.
Always that way.
And boarding houses were really big, where people rented rooms. I found this hard to believe, but you said it's true. At one point, there were 21 people living in this house. How many kids did the Petersons have?
So the Petersons had 12 children, but unfortunately only about 5 of whom reached adulthood, right?
So he's a successful, he's living here, and then we get to April 14th, 1865. And of course, across the street, Abraham Lincoln is mortally wounded by John Wilkes Booth. Doctors gather, and they don't want Lincoln to die in the theater. So he's brought out into the street. There's all kind of commotion in the street. And a boarder here, right? What was his name?
His name was Henry Safford. He lived right upstairs. Right
Henry Safford is in the house. Here's the commotion. Comes down to the front stoop. What's going on? He figures out, and he says, bring him in here. So Lincoln is brought into the Peterson House. This is a really good depiction, this painting.
So the title is called Lincoln Born with Loving Hands.
Okay, and it shows him being brought across the street into the Peterson House.
Yes, yeah. So this was painted by a guy by the name of Carl Bursch. At the time, he was only he was a young boy, about 8, 9 years old. He rented a room with his parents here on this side of 10th Street. And so he remembers, as a young kid, looking out the windows and down onto the crowd as they carry out Lincoln from the doors of the theater onto the street.
So we're going to see 3 rooms. This is the front parlor. The furniture's not original, but it's to the period, and it does very much give you the ambiance of what it looked like in this house.
Yes, so this space right where we're standing, this would have been a sitting parlor attached to this back room that was rented out. So these 2 parlors, again, keep in mind this is a family home, right? So this would have been where the family gathered, but as the need for housing arose during the American Civil War with the population of D.C. nearly tripling by 1865, again, people started to take up residence. So these 2 rooms would have been rented together. This front parlor, however, would have had chairs, would have had a sofa, a couch, would have been able to see a couple different people.
Comfortable room.
Comfortable room. But as soon as they bring Lincoln inside, right,
Right.
it's not just Abraham Lincoln that is there in that box. It's not just him that is wounded, but in fact, 3 other individuals are there with him, right? Of course, his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, is there, and 2 guests, Miss Clara Harris and Major Henry Rathbone. They come across the street as well. Miss Clara Harris ends up coming in here with Mary Todd Lincoln, helping to escort her. She stays with her the entire night, holding her hand here in this front parlor.
Oh, my.
Her fiance, Major Henry Rathbone, who gets slashed across the arm by John Wilkes Booth, he would actually end up passing out in the hallway due to blood loss, right? So he is now incapacitated. He gets carried out elsewhere, but Clara Harris ends up staying here in the house with Mary. There is another actress, a lady by the name of Laura Keene. She is the leading actress from that night.
From the play.
From the play, Our American Cousin. And she comes across here as well and stays with Mary Todd Lincoln. So it seems bizarre to us today, right, to keep a spouse separate from their loved one after they're being wounded. But this was the mindset of the time, especially with Mary Todd Lincoln. A lot of people simply write her off as crazy. She's not crazy, but she's full of grief. She's hysterical at this point. And anyone would
I mean, who
probably
wouldn't
say.
be?
And so, under doctor's orders, they don't allow her to go into that back room very much. Only about twice throughout the night. So imagine that stress, that trauma from that particular instance.
That's incredible. So she spends most of her time in this room.
Most of her time,
Okay.
yeah.
So there was a door that separated it, right?
Yep, double doors.
Double doors. You can kind of see the remnants of the hinge up here. So this room would have been closed off. Let's come on into this room here. This is the back parlor, I guess?
Back parlor.
Back parlor. And this is where, according to the sign, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, sets up camp basically and starts the manhunt almost immediately for what's going on. So this is the seat of government, basically. For what? Lincoln's in here for 9 hours?
9 hours.
9 hours.
So first things first, this room again, as I said before, was rented out. Every single one of these rooms was full. So sleeping in this back bed was going to be a young couple by the name of Jonathan and Huldah Francis from Rochester, New York. And so they're here, they hear the commotion as people start to come inside. Shortly after, they hear on the door.
Yeah.
Edwin Stanton comes inside. He orders them to leave, right?
Yeah.
They, of course, comply. And now Edwin Stanton takes up shop. He realizes that he can't organize this manhunt, this response alone, so he calls out to the crowd for another gentleman, this younger gentleman here. If you want to find another picture later, but this is a great photograph. This young gentleman, his name is James Tanner. He is a 21-year-old Civil War veteran, a bilateral amputee. He lost both of his legs at the Battle of Second Manassas.
He lives right next door, right?
And he lived right next door in another boarding house. But he is out in the crowd. He hears the commotion. He knows stenography and also knows how to operate a telegraph machine. So he comes in here, volunteers his services with Stanton. And those are going to be the primary 2 that are here that night.
And Tanner records all the conversations.
Every single conversation. So not only just eyewitness accounts as they bring people inside to help record those, nearly 200 pages they write down.
And his stenography notebook still survives, correct?
I'm not sure about that.
I think I've seen something. It's in Philly.
Possibly.
Maybe.
I don't know if it's on my head.
Yeah, but regardless, it's a remarkable story of him doing all that.
Yeah.
So this room itself was boarded out. Now, the family, the Petersons, are here, but they're in the basement during this, correct?
William Peterson is notably not here. He most likely goes to his tailor shop, but his children are.
His children are.
His children are. So, interestingly enough, Fred Peterson, the oldest, 15, Ferdinand is his full name, he's actually at another theater watching a performance of Aladdin at Grover's Theater, a.k.a. where Tad Lincoln was the night of the assassination.
Wow.
So all of a sudden, some guy jumps up on stage, announces that the president's been shot, and now Ferdinand Peterson says, man, I want to go home. He comes into this house little knowing that this is now the epicenter of the Lincoln assassination.
Oh, my God.
So Ferdinand Peterson helps out, Anna Jr. and William Jr., they all help out bringing water from the basement up to the bedroom.
Oh, it's amazing.
William Peterson, might I add, is not a Republican. He does not vote Republican. He does not vote for Lincoln. He, again, John C. Breckinridge stayed in this house as well, so you kind of see where his sympathies are. He is not here.
Didn't stop him from making Union officers' uniforms. So.
Oh, well, money's money.
Money's money, right, yeah. So let's go ahead back into the room where actually Lincoln is brought and where he will pass away.
Sure.
So here we are, and this is where Lincoln is brought in this bed, and it was a boarder's room as well. So tell us a little bit about what happens when he's brought here.
Yeah, so almost immediately, and if you turn back around for a second, you can almost see straight down the hallway, right out through the front door, kind of where that exit sign is there today. And that front door, that door opens up with Henry Safford calling out. Again, they don't know where to bring him exactly.
Yeah.
So the renter that rented out this room, William T. Clark from Lowell, Massachusetts, he's only 19 years old. But again, Civil War combat veteran and a War Department clerk.
He's a clerk.
He's a clerk in the War Department, yeah.
But
so
he had seen combat or action.
Seen combat.
Okay.
At Gettysburg, notably. He was with the 13th Massachusetts.
Okay, William Clark. Okay.
William Clark.
Okay.
But William Clark is not here. He is partying, celebrating the end of the war, as the majority of Washington, D.C. is.
Right.
But they see this open doorway. They say, bring him right down in here. So straight down the hallway, right through where you're standing, into this back room. They try and lay him on the bed. They realize the bed's a little too short. And the bed today is about 5'10", 5'11" on a good day, right?
Okay.
But they order the soldiers to start kicking off the footboard. They realize that that's going to damage the structural integrity of the bed.
Yeah.
They stop that. Instead, they lay Lincoln diagonally across the bed.
So this is the room in which Lincoln dies. What time does he pass away?
So he survives throughout the night. Keep in mind the wound was inflicted at about 10:15 p.m. He's carried over here at about 10:30, 10:45, but he passes away, survives through the night 9 hours at 7:22 a.m., April 15th, 1865.
Wow. And this photo was taken. There was a boarder in here that was a photographer.
Yes, two were.
The bed is still disheveled. Is this after Clark was in it?
No, so this is actually immediately after Lincoln's body was removed.
Oh.
So the two brothers that end up taking this photograph, Julius and Henry Yolka, they again are just like the Petersons. They are German immigrants. They are, shall we say, Renaissance men. They love science and technology. Julius Yolka was actually an amateur entomologist. One of the reasons why we know is through the archaeological record here in this house. We found glass microscope slides with beetle wings still attached.
Oh, that's
which
incredible.
is amazing, right? To see that everyone here has a name and a story.
Yeah.
But the other brother, Henry, he is very much so involved in photography. They emigrate here to the United States in order to capture images of Civil War battlefields like Brady and Gardner, right? They're a little less famous, of course. But here in this house, they are upstairs above our heads on the second floor. And when they're renting out the room that night, they're not even U.S. citizens yet. So as soldiers and War Department officials come flooding in, cabinet members come flooding in, they realize they need to put this house on lockdown. So they lock the Yolka brothers in their room. They have no clue what's happening beneath their very floorboards.
Did they do that with all the boarders?
Not with all the boarders. Only the ones that they didn't have any question. They had questions about, right?
Yeah,
their
like
loyalties.
where's your ID, that kind of thing.
I mean, Clark, Jonathan, Francis, they're War
veterans.
workers.
Right,
Yeah. So they have a reputation.
Right.
But the Yolka brothers, right? So they're locked in their room, and so everything that's happening down here at about 8 a.m., right? So about 40 minutes after Lincoln's passing, they remove his body from the bed. They put it in a small makeshift pinewood box, carry it right back out onto the streets, and they unlock the doors.
Wow.
The Yolka brothers come down, set up their camera in the back left corner, and capture this image. This is the only known image of the interior of the boarding house.
It's just incredible. And Clark comes in after all this is going on, and I find this so hard to believe, but he basically just passes out on the bed with Lincoln's blood and everything.
Yeah, and it's interesting there because he had a full night as well. Not only of course, drinking and partying beforehand, but as soon as he arrives to his home, to his residence that he paid good money for, right? He sees the situation and he immediately jumps in to help, right? So he's already been awake probably 24 hours, continuing on through the night, bringing up water and supplies to this back room, physically ripping up his clothes, his bed sheets to use as bandages here. So Clark is here on occasion coming in and out of this room.
Okay.
And so because of that, right, he's left with all the damages, right? And this is still his room. He's still paid money for it. But of course he does pass out in the bed eventually. But beforehand, I think what's even more touching is the fact that he sees in a pile on the floor, just on the other side of the bed, Lincoln's clothes that are bloodied and muddied and stamped into the carpet. He takes those clothes, he launders them, he folds them, ties them in a bow, and with a letter of condolences, gives them back to Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's eldest son. So a small, touching aspect, but something that's important.
So, it's not like he just came drunk and collapsed. He was exhausted because he'd done all this else.
Because he had participated.
Yeah, wow.
And everyone here in the house, every boarder helped out. Again, the Peterson children, Henry Safford, the Yoka brothers in their indirect way. Even Thomas Proctor, Henry Safford's roommate. So everyone helped out in some weird way.
This is why we had to get here early.
Yeah.
Oh, this is nothing too. We could have lines going all the way down past Hard Rock.
So this would have been jam-packed full. So if you look all the way down, the first floor is the orchestra level, the second level, that's where Lincoln was, and the third level where we're standing, this is the family circle. So this place was jam-packed full of 1,700 people.
And I'm back with Garrett Cost, interpretive ranger here at Ford's Theater. We are actually in Ford's Theater right now. We are in what's called the boardroom, this beautiful room. This is a reproduction of a period painting of Lincoln.
So the original building on this property, believe it or not, was actually a church. It was a Baptist church here in Washington, D.C. That building was built in 1832. That was the first building on this property. But the congregation moved elsewhere, and by 1861, so right in the beginning of the American Civil War, two brothers, two theater moguls by the name of John T. and Harry C. Ford, who owned properties in Baltimore at the Holiday Street Theater, in Richmond, Virginia as well. They saw this building, knew they wanted to go ahead and open up a theater. So they purchased that original building. And basically, it was already a great venue for a theater. They just simply turned it around, and called it the Ford's Athenaeum. So it was like a music hall. Right? In 1862, there was a fire inside that building and burnt it down to the ground, every single little last bit. But they do rebuild on this property, and that's the building that we're in right now. Okay. So the original brick on the exterior, original huge wooden oak trusses up at the top, and this new building is known as Ford's New Theater. This area of D.C. today is a nicer federal district, right? So you have office buildings and whatnot. Yeah. In the 1860s, this is not the case. This is very much so a red light district with bars and brothels and gambling dens and theaters, places of ill and low repute.
Interesting, right?
So Ford's Theater was just one of those that catered to that.
One of those. So was Ford's considered a more respectable theater then? I would think so.
Yeah. The Fords did everything in their power to try and make it more marketable.
And then getting to the post-war years, it becomes a government office, basically.
Yes. So immediately after Lincoln's death, and when I say immediately, I mean within 30, 40 minutes, there are soldiers that are dispatched here to Ford's Theater. For those of you more militarily inclined, you may know them as the Veteran Reserve Corps. More specifically, the 9th Veteran Reserve Corps Company C. They are going to be dispatched here, and they make quick work of this theater, moving people out of the theater, putting this place on lockdown almost immediately. Doesn't stop looting, however. Looting still continues inside the theater. Swatches of wallpaper, furniture, drapes. The Fords, the owners of the theater, the Fords, John T. and Harry C., they're arrested as well for fringe charges of conspiracy. On April 16th, 1865, this theater reopens for one day just to have the actors and actresses re-perform the play up on stage with no one else in the audience except for Edwin Stanton and a few handful of stenographers to see the who, the where, the why inside the theater.
Wow.
So imagine that as the actors and actresses reliving those traumatic experiences. But those soldiers, the 9th Veteran Reserve Corps, they are living here inside this building, this theater, and roughly, actually, right about where we're sitting today in this boardroom, there was what the doorkeeper, John Buckingham, said, a pretty little women's waiting room, is what he described it as. But the soldiers used this space as their ration space, so they cooked rations. They had a campfire in this pretty little waiting room, and as John Buckingham describes, greased up the chairs and the floorboards and everything around it, so they made quick work of the theater as well. By late 1865, the Fords wanted to reopen. The public thought that was a horrible idea. The War Department comes in. They purchase the building from the Fords for about $100,000. The Fords are doing just fine. They have 4 other theaters. They're doing fine, but this theater gets turned upside down. The War Department wants to make sure there is no more plays, no more productions inside. So they decide to rip out everything. The stage, the boxes, the balconies, the seats, and they turn it less than 6 months later, by November of 1865, into a War Department office building, into the Pension and Records Bureau.
The first one, I think.
The first one. This is also the first home of the Army Medical Museum. So in Silver Spring, Maryland today, that's where that's located. So this had interesting medical equipment here inside, amputated limbs and severed heads and brains in jars and all those interesting accoutrements. But as the time goes on, the temporary floors that were installed inside are temporary in construction. They are getting heavier with paperwork and tables and chairs. And by the morning of June 9th, 1893, as 500 office workers pile into this building, the walls start to buckle and the floors collapse. A 40-foot section from the third floor, where we're on now, falls into the second floor below us, into the first, into the basement, killing 22 federal workers, injuring 68.
Including some Civil War veterans.
Including some Civil War veterans. They were actually right in the middle of the Indiana state pension records when they were doing that.
Oh, man.
It's just amazing.
When does it get fully restored?
Yeah, so this building is largely abandoned. Still under the War Department. The War Department wants to destroy the building, dismantle the building. In the 1920s, interestingly enough, a gentleman by the name of Henry Riggs Rathbone. If you remember that last name, Rathbone, the name of Major Henry Rathbone, the gentleman who stabbed by Booth, he is the eldest son of Miss Clara Harris and Major Henry Rathbone. He gets elected as a representative, just like Abraham Lincoln does, and just like Abraham Lincoln, he has a pretty mediocre career as a representative. I'll put it that way, right? The only piece of federal legislation that he provides and passes is a 1924 bill, House Act 16656, to create what we now call Ford's Theater National Historic Site.
Oh, okay.
So the whole reason why this building is spared is because of him.
And
so 1924, the building is spared. 1932, it's handed over to the National Park Service from the War Department. Not till 1964, that Ford's Theater Society comes to fruition. Again, our nonprofit partner, helping to raise money, turn this place back into a thriving cultural institution. 1968 is when that renovation is finally completed. And ever since 1968, we have had shows and productions up on this stage. So shows, musicals, just like Lincoln would have seen.
Garrett, I want to thank you so much for showing us around today. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. And this is Dana Schoaf and Garrett Cost, and signing off from overlooking, I guess we could say, overlooking the presidential box here at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. See you soon.